The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus glanced up and saw the rich putting their offerings into the treasury, and also a poor widow putting in 2 copper coins. At that he said, "I assure you this poor widow has put in more than all the rest. They make contribution out of their surplus, but she, from her want, has given what she could not afford, every penny she had to live on." The Gospel of the Lord. Let us all be seeing. Today is Monday of the 34th week and last week of the year. And the Mass continues to review what we must do in order to have everlasting life. And the Gospel for today precisely reminds us what the past Gospel has been teaching us, that in order to be able to go to heaven, we must love God with all our minds, all our hearts, and all our strength, which leaves no place for our minds and hearts to love anything in the world, since all of our minds and hearts are supposed to love God, so it must be completely empty of anything that is not God. And the fastest way to do this is to put into practice what you call the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so we have the 3 young men in the Old Testament, precisely led by Daniel, showing that if you are able to give up all worldly things, cleansing your minds and your hearts, so that your minds and hearts can concentrate on spiritual and divine things, then God will reward you with the gifts of the Holy Spirit, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, not only of spiritual things, but even of natural and physical things. And so we have the example of Daniel and the 3 young men becoming advisors to the king precisely because of the spiritual gifts given to them. And these gifts are only given to those who have perfected their faith and their charity, at least the beginnings of charity, keeping in mind that faith is an act of the intellect, while charity is an act of the free will. And so as long as our intellect and our free will are used completely in the service of God, then we have offered to God the best and the most pleasing sacrifice. The Gospel for today tells us that the Pharisees and the scribes were watching those who were offering to God sacrifices. And Christ noticed and took this notice to the apostles that the rich were offering so much in the temple, while at the same time they saw a poor widow who was offering only 2 coins. St. Thomas of Aquinas says that that poor widow was a beggar. She was begging from other people, and whatever she received from other people, all of it was offered to God. So while she was not begging for herself or for the members of her family. She was begging from people to offer it to God. Now, the gospel should not be understood just physically. As St. Thomas says, there is always a mystical meaning or a spiritual and moral meaning of the gospel, which you should understand, because the interpretation of the gospel, of the teachings of Christ, can be found in its moral or mystical meaning, which Christ himself gave to the apostles and to the first Christians, and they were collected and written down later on by the holy bishops of the Catholic Church, who were described as the fathers of the Church. And so this interpretation of Christ himself, collected by the fathers of the Church, is the only official interpretation of the gospel. And so what does it mean that the poor widow offered 2 coins, which Christ found very pleasing and therefore gave it as an example to his apostles? St. Thomas says that those 2 coins are the symbol of the 2 commandments of Christ. First, to love God, and secondly, to love your neighbor. Or another way of putting it, the 2 coins are first, your intellect, which you use completely and primarily to learn the teachings of Christ, and secondly, your free will in using it to love only the things of heaven. So these are the 2 coins. So the first coin is to love God. How do you love God? Christ himself says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Now, Christ gave us many commandments, and you can summarize the commandments of Christ in this one command. What is this? Save your souls. Cooperate with God in saving your soul. It is not you, really, who will save your souls. Only God can save your soul. But you must cooperate with God, who is trying to save your souls. St. Augustine says, God created you without your help, but he will not save you without your help. And so it is God who saves us, but we must help God. And how do we do that? Do not contradict God when he is saving you. You must cooperate by simply being humble. Because when you are humble, then God can lead you anywhere He wants. And that is cooperating with God who is trying to save you. So the first coin is to love God by obeying His command. And what is God's command? Be humble and cooperate with God who is saving your souls. Second coin. The second coin is help your neighbors obey the commandments of Christ. The first command or the first coin is that you obey the will of God. Love of neighbor, the second command is you teach your neighbor the will of God and how to obey the commandments of Christ. So why are we in the monastery? Because we want to have those two coins that the poor widow offered to God. Why was she described as a poor widow? Because we have to be humble, or as the first beatitude described, poor in spirit. So we are the poor widow. We cannot be rich in spirit or rich widows. Who are the rich widow or the rich in spirit? Those who are thinking too much of many worldly concerns, and their hearts are filled with worldly desires. That's the rich widow. That's the rich in spirit. So who are those who are poor in spirit? They are poor in their minds because they are concentrated only in the things of God. They have only one thing in mind to please God. Only one thing, one coin in their mind, learning how to please God, and one coin in their hearts, only trying to love God. And so we are in the monastery precisely to earn those two coins that we may make this a very pleasing offering to God. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit.